So today, as the title says, we're going to explore how we get into the news story for business. What is the news story? How does it come about? And what's our part within it? We have about 50 minutes or so booked with you to have this conversation. And I do hope it will be a conversation, because I'm going to allow some time a little bit later in the session to open up the floor for some contributions, some responses, some dialogue, some challenge, whatever you feel is prompted by some of the sharing that I'll offer up to that point. So my name's Lorraine Flower, and I'm part of Azure, which is a leadership and organizational development consultancy. We've been operating for over 20 years now, and have seen many changes in the world of work and the world of business, world of organizations. My own credentials, well, interesting when we think about some of the conversation that may arise today, but I'm a product of the Thatcher era. I started work in the late 70s, so 40 years in work in one form or another, pretty much all of it in the for-profit sector, although from a consulting point of view, working across the public and private sectors. And I remember a conversation with one of my chief executives many years ago now, where he was encouraging me to pay more attention to the numbers, to the profit, to the impacts that we were having financially, which was not unreasonable given that I was the sales and marketing director at the time. But what I noticed in reflecting back on that is that actually throughout my career, from the very beginning, my interest in work had a much deeper connection for me than how much money were we making, or what's the profit that we're working towards. Not to say those things aren't important, but they've not necessarily been the foremost in my mind, with meaning, values, identity sitting much more prominently on the list. Through the time of those 40 years, my increasing focus, certainly in the last 25 years, has been around spirituality in the workplace and conscious leadership. And you'll see some of that, I think, come through in what I plan to share with you today. But it's not the primary focus of this session. It is about some of the very real and practical things that we need to do to address this new story and why it's needed. So our agenda today then is to think outside the box, to try and challenge some of our traditional thinking, perhaps around the way we look at the role of business, and to think about what we actually mean about a news story and why is it needed. I'm going to touch briefly on what's happening today. I say briefly because hours could be spent on what's happening today. There is a lot going on out there in the news story of business, and that's encouraging, and I feel optimistic about that. The challenge here is the pace and the level of coalition that we have around that. And then how do we get radical? How do we play our part in a way that goes beyond the constraints as we perceive them in the world of business, and the systems and infrastructures and mindsets that we've set up in that space? I'll put up a blueprint, which is just a series of reflections, but I think deeply held reflections based on the time and research and feeling that we at Azure have around this topic. So in terms of our role and how we show up in this space, I think it's really important to recognize that being passive is not an option for us. And this quote by Eisenhower encourages us to think about the fact that we have an active role to play in the future, and that it's not about just waiting for it to happen. We know the world's in a space of massive shift, probably unprecedented in modern times in many ways, and in many ways finely balanced between the degree to which what I would call good, the things for the greater good of humanity, the planet, our own sense of civilization and sense of love, the degree to which those advancements will succeed and take us forward into a new era of human civilization, and the degree to which greed, fear, some of the more destructive elements that we see going on in the world today, the degree to which those are able to destroy what humanity has been able to achieve up to this point. So finely balanced, as I said, and each of us is called upon to make choices about how we live our lives and the role that we play in the future of that world. This news story is not just about business, it's across politics, religion, health, education, economy, business. It touches every area. But what we're talking about today is that news story for business, and it's just one of those areas that we have to make some choices around. So why have a news story for business? What's driving that? I think this quote from Klaus Schwab is useful and encouraging. You may or may not know about the World Economic Forum. It's been running for many years. There are cynical views about it and there are optimistic views about it. It is a coming together of the great and hopefully the good, increasingly I think the good, and very powerful and influential people, businesses, politicians, world leaders. And the emphasis is increasingly on how we change our world for the better. And this quote from Schwab, I think, brings out some of the key things that we need to be thinking about from the point of view of business. How do we move to a space of inclusive growth? I'm going to talk more about growth as we go on. How do we preserve our scarce resources? Well, that's all over the news at the moment, thankfully, and hopefully will prompt us into even more action than we are currently taking, which is clearly not sufficient. How do we find new models of cooperation across organizations, across the different departments of politics and religion and business and economy? And how do we move beyond narrow interests and move to focus ourselves on the destiny of humanity as a whole? These are questions that we need to address ourselves to. And we can look to many places to think about where that agenda is being set. But I find this, the Sustainable Development Goals set out by the United Nations back in 2017 as a recast of a previous set of work done in this area, as a very succinct and very challenging agenda. And not that business necessarily has to play in every single area, but when we look at these 17 goals, we'd be hard pressed to argue that business is exempt from any of them. In fact, has its own goal, number 8, decent work and economic growth. So there are many areas where we can take stimulus from the size of the agenda that is ahead of us, and why business may need to play its role in that. The UN has estimated that in order to achieve these goals, and the target is to achieve it by 2030, so we have very few years, in fact a decade left really, they're estimating that $5 to $7 trillion is going to be needed yearly to enable us to meet this commitment of the Sustainable Development Goals, $5 to $7 trillion. And so we have to think about the way in which business can contribute to that. And we know there is that much money moving around in the system. It's a question of how and where it's deployed. And to do that, we have to change the way in which the money goes around. We have to change that energy source, which is how I see money. It's a source of energy. It enables us, it facilitates things to happen. It's not an end in its own right. But we have to help that to go around the system in a different way. And we do that by increasing the conversation between people, talking about how to do that, what the right principles are for achieving that, and adjusting our attitudes to what we believe money is about in the system. Business is expected to lead. And so what I'm putting out here is not a new thought. It's not that it's in itself is radical. Edelman undertake a trust survey annually, and these results come from both the 2018 and 2019 survey. It's undertaken across 33,000 respondents globally of all demographic profiles. And 76% of those profiled, of those responding, say that they believe CEOs should take the lead on change rather than waiting for governments to impose it. We know governments can have an impact. We know that legislation can have an impact, but we have to get beyond waiting for that sledgehammer to create the sort of change that we need. And CEOs have a fundamental role, meaning business has a fundamental role. And again, in the similar survey, but in the 2019 results, 71% of employees feel that it's critically important for the CEO and therefore their organization to respond to the challenges that we see at this point in time in our world, that it isn't enough and it isn't appropriate for business to batten down the hatches and think it can focus on just its own immediate concerns or considerations, that it has to extend its profile and its connection. And this issue of trust and relationship plays to the way in which employees will participate in business going forward. And there are 5 topics where that have come out particularly significant in this survey, where employees are expecting their employers, so the business, to play an active and significant role. Societal values, how the organization sees its role in the future and its own vision of the future, the quality and nature of its purpose, and the way it goes about doing its work. So employees are no longer sitting waiting for employers to make these decisions. They are actively championing that level of connection and responsibility. And equally arguing that businesses must show a commitment to the long term. For anybody who is actively in the business world now, we know that in fact businesses can be very short-term focused, particularly at a point when it is when there's a lot of pressure on, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of fear, a lot of tendency to look after number one in that situation. And so it's really important that we make sure that we think about the long-term position, and there is some question mark over the degree to which that's where CEOs are currently, with only 56% think about themselves, where 56% of people surveyed agreed that companies only think about themselves and their profits, and if they do so, that they're bound to fail. And 60% agree that CEOs are driven more by greed than a desire to make a positive difference in the world. So if we go back to the expectation of chief executives and business, we're finding that 60% of them, according to the survey, are perceived to be failing in that broader responsibility. And so coming to a clear ethical and long-term purpose is a major factor in trust between employees and employers, but also between business and the world in which it operates. And one example here that that perhaps is useful to bring out is a company called Oatly. It's a Swedish oat milk brand, and it plays heavily on the environmental impact of drinking cow's milk, where cow's milk has 3 times the environmental impact of a plant-based product. And their slogan, their strapline, their purpose, if you will, is drink this milk and help build a better world. And this has an appeal to Generation Zs, the people who are just coming into the workplace. It also has an appeal to millennials because it's ethically motivated. And so businesses have to think about, why are we in business? Why do we go out and do what we do each day? And how are we contributing to a better world? Another factor that makes a difference, I think, in how we think about the news story is the question of work. And work matters. Work is something that is not just about paying the rent or putting food on the table. And I know that there are many, many people, billions of people, who are struggling to do both of those things, and it's getting harder. And many of us in this call will be in a very privileged position when it comes to safety, security, and survival. And yet, even when we go beyond that and define work more broadly than just the traditional ways of looking at it, we see that work is an expression of our identity. It gives us a sense of meaning. It allows us to express our talents and our qualities. And we can define work as parenting, caregivers, volunteers, chief executives, musicians, scientists. You know, work is a very broad spectrum in terms of how we go about living our lives and where we make our contribution in the world. It gives us our sense of purpose. It allows us to express ourselves. It actually is a soul expression. It's an expression of who we are and how we are in the world. And it allows us to find our own pathway of growth. And when we think about the new future of work, we need to see that these factors will survive the onslaught of technology, and that we are the determinants of how that technology gets used. So being active in the way we define work in the future is also a critical responsibility of business, and not simply allowing technology to be the driving force because it delivers a better profit. We have to think about it from the human perspective. So I said I'd speak briefly about some of the things that are going on currently, and this is a very brief overview of some of those things. The money tree here, of course, we have to talk about economy, the new economy, conscious capitalism. There's quite a big movement in this space. Has it caught fire on a universal level? No, for sure not. But there is a growing level of activity and groups and organizations that are working in this space. We have B corporations, first founded in the US, which are more sort of socially responsible organizations, not for profit, very much environmentally and ethically focused. We have an increase in ethical investment within the financial market. We have something called impact investing, which started in 2007 and is now $502 billion worth of financial investment. We have much more work going on between brand, values, ethics, and purpose alignment within organizations, Oakley being but one example. We have more focus on new economy, on sustainability, on the environment and climate change. And organizations have done quite a lot in this space, sometimes because they have to, sometimes because it's a marketing thing, sometimes because genuinely their heart is aligned and their soul is aligned. We see more and more multi-stakeholder collaborations across community, business, government, NGOs, more collaboration to solve some of the bigger challenges that we see in the world. There is a greater focus on humanness in some organizations. There's an organization called AES, which is an electricity supplier. And the former chief executive of that, a chap called Dennis Back, spoke of a culture of joy, and the values of that organization were integrity, fairness, fun, and love thy neighbor. And he focused heavily on meaning and value from the point of view of employees, recognizing that allowed them to contribute into work and into the business in a much more meaningful and joyful way. Also active in this space, and you may know of this case study, it's a living expression, is an organization called Barry-Wehmiller. Again, their chief executive focuses on human-centered leadership. Increasingly trying to bring the word love into the workplace, and there are many people that are now starting to talk about that. Yes, getting some pushback. Yes, it's an uncomfortable conversation, but it is nevertheless starting to appear. We have many leaders that are active in this space. Richard Branson has established something called the B Team, some years ago now, going out and looking at new ways of doing business globally, small organizations, large organizations, leading the way from a policy and principles point of view. Paul Polman of Unilever pushing back to the financial markets, saying that short-term focus is not where he's going to be responding, and that they have to trust in him to bring the business forward in the long term. Similarly, Indra Nooyi of PepsiCo speaks of how for years she was slated for her performance because it wasn't delivering in the short term. When she brought the results through in the long term, suddenly she's hailed as the best thing since sliced bread. But there wasn't the belief and the confidence in her longer term vision. And so she took an awful lot of challenge over that in leading PepsiCo's future. Frans van Houten, the CEO of Philips, brought forward, actually through the World Economic Forum, something called the Responsive Leadership Compact, which was, again, a way of raising consciousness amongst key businesses for the way in which they need to contribute into the world. Companies like Zappos are restructuring the way that they engage with their employees so that they have much more determination in the future of the business. And we see a lot going on in the world of diversity at the moment. Yes, we can look at that as gender, and we are seeing much more shift on the gender conversation with, as I said, Generation Z, millennials, older workforces, women, and so on and so forth. But increasingly that conversation is also moving to diversity of thought, diversity of culture, diversity of contribution. And it's not easy for organizations to tackle these things, but they are starting to do so. So what are some of the questions that might be out there for us in the new story? Well, if we think about it as a story, and some of the archetypes and the themes that might run through a story, we could ask ourselves the question of who and what is good and what is evil in our new story, and what's their place? What does it mean to have the good hero, the good protagonist, the person that is going to save the day, or the institutions that are going to save the day? And what is represented, what does evil look like in our new story, and what do we need to be aware of? And what's our ambition? What are we going for? What's the prize? What's our holy grail? What does that look like? There's always some sort of prize in our fairy stories and our myths. There has to be some sort of outcome that is that favors the winner in a particular way. Who is that winner, and who do we want that to be? What do our heroes and heroines look like? Who are they? What qualities do they have? And what's the context that we're seeking to have? What's the culture? What's the way in which we function? What's our wonderland? And when you create new, something has to be destroyed. So what has to be destroyed? And what needs to come through? What's the new that needs to shine through? And there will be other questions in our story. And so just to give you warning, I'm about to open this up for discussion. And some of the things that I think are out there for us to think about in terms of our discussion, our sharing, our response, our contributions, are the things on this slide here. How do these show up in our new story? In what way do they need to be different? In what way do we need to step up to a new understanding of these elements? And there may be things there that you think about, or other things that are missing, things that should be on that list. So what does it mean to get radical? And what are some of the things that we might need to think about? So I'm going to open this up a little bit, hopefully having stimulated something. Hopefully you're coming with some thoughts that you want to contribute. In order to participate, I'm going to take, I've muted everybody, so I'm going to unmute us all. And keen to hear anything that you'd like to say prompted so far, anything that these set of words, of themes prompt for you about the new story for business. And let's see where we get to in our discussion. Okay, so we're now all unmuted. And if you want to contribute, I'm going to just stop for a second, and feel free to do so. And if you could just say your name, that would be great. And bear in mind we are recording, so others can listen to this after we're done.
Hello, I'm Sonia.
Hi, Sonia.
Just to cut the silence, because it's really complicated or difficult to start speaking when everybody wonder if another one doesn't want to speak and so on. Anyway,
Yes, thank you.
Not forgive, but as you probably pick it up, I've got a French accent, so very glad to participate to this webinar. I think there are great questions, and the one I was focusing on is what needs to be destroyed, and not destroyed in the sense of getting rid of all the things, but just to make the space for something new to happen. And for me, there is something around the governance of the company and the why of the company. I was watching a little video from Simon Sinek about the why and the personal why, and obviously in the company the personal why will get intricated in the global why of the company. But for me, from what I can perceive, there is too much why oriented on the money we can do, and the question is, how can we free ourselves from the pressure of the shareholders dictate. And I know the word is a bit strong, but and I know it's a needed thing, because all the society is run around this system. I don't know if it's only because people need the money to have their retirement fees and stuff paid, but I think that we need to have the courage to rethink the need of making money for the sake of making money and please our skateholder.
Thank you, Sonia. Yeah, I'm absolutely with you on that. If you think about the billions, absolute billions, that is moving around in the hands of a very small number of people, and if that were redistributed across, going back to the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the amount of money needed to achieve those goals and objectives, the amount of money that is floating around that. So again, we think about that as energy, we can think about it as hard cash. There's something about the value systems, the values that shareholders have. And I remember, again, as I say, I was a product of the Thatcher era and capitalism, and when we had share privatization of nationalized industries here in the UK, and the anticipation and the excitement of being able to go and buy or to get free if you were in the company, or buy cheap shares in order to make money in the future. And the whole focus was on how we would make money out of not having to do very much except put a bit of money into an organization. And we need, that's the mentality, as you say, that sits in the system for particularly for-profit businesses. And until we can shift that mindset amongst shareholders, and there are stories of billionaires who are giving their wealth to philanthropic projects. Bill Gates, the Gates Foundation is one very public example of that, very high profile example. But there are many examples. There's a list of 150 odd billionaires who've all committed to donate their wealth to better projects and not let it go through into the family. So you're right, how much money do we need is a real question.
Mm.
I think sorry, hi, it's Trudy here. I think the shareholder thing is the shareholder mindset's a very interesting one, because it's caught in that paradigm of it's all about profit. It's all about how much money can be accumulated. And yet, if organisations could get brave enough to work on the basis of if you're a shareholder, you're in it for the long term because you believe in the purpose of the organisation, so why it exists in the world. That fundamentally shifts it, and I'm kind of minded to think about a case study for Costco, which at the time was run by a guy called Jim Sinegal. And he was basically told by his shareholders that they wanted a better return, and so he should pay his staff less. And he said to them, essentially, if you don't agree with how we treat our people, then we don't want you as shareholders, so sell your stock. Now, that's a very brave stance to take, but I think, you know, the case studies or the people that Lorraine's mentioned, like Paul Polman, for example, who was at Unilever, you know, focusing on the long term. These are, I mean, Unilever's got a massive reach, and of course Costco is global as well. But these are small examples of the kind of courage that we need to see in chief executives and see business, you know, taking the lead on this. That start to help but we need more of it.
And I also think there's a question about which comes back to the what needs to be destroyed question. I think there's also a real question which I don't hear anybody really talking about, which is, can these larger organizations, particularly the global ones, can they survive the future if they don't make some of these sorts of changes? Because there are a lot of new businesses being set up where the mindset that Trudy and Sonia are speaking about in terms of shareholder mindset and the mindset around money is shifting. So a lot of socially responsible organizations, a lot of cooperative organizations where employees are the shareholders. I mean, that's not new. It's not that's you know, that's an unusual situation. But instead of that being a money and profit oriented thing, it's about investment of self in the purpose and in the future of that organization. And again, it's small seeds, but there is growth of that type of thing going on. And I just wonder if some of these larger organizations who are not led by more enlightened CEOs and boards, whether in fact they will implode at some point, you know, whether there will actually be some sort of catastrophic financial event that means that they are unable to sustain their way of being. Because if more money moves into the ethical investment area, it will be harder. So there was an example that I read about where there was a big movement to disinvest in the fossil fuel companies, so the oil suppliers, and there was that movement was made by some banks and some activists to withdraw funds out of fossil fuel suppliers or companies into other things, into more ethical investment, and to really put a lot of pressure on banks to do that. And that started to change the way in which those businesses started to operate. Now, have we seen a wholesale change? No, but there is power. So if we come back to power, control, and influence, there is a different source of power in the system. We have to have the courage to leverage that. Ultimately, that the people who were kind of leading that also had to then change the way that they supported banks, because banks institutionally were continuing to go on and invest in fossil fuel companies. And so they then had to disinvest in banks as well in order to get the pressure on for change to happen. So we are seeing more and more banks, you know, big global multinational banks focusing more on ethical investment. So we have to recognize we've got power and control in the system. We have to work out how to leverage it. Any other contributions or thoughts? Anything else prompted?
Hi, it's Michelle here. Apologies for being late. um, uh, I kind of signed up because I now work for Pearson, which is a global organisation, but it's just recently celebrated its 175th birthday.
Wow.
And that kind of got me thinking about our changing world and that organisation, its longevity, and the point you just made about, you know, will these large global organisations survive? And the points you make about it's kind of like the external world forces us, I guess, on an individual organisational level to make change. But Pearson's a fascinating organisation in that some of it may be rhetoric, but it's always had a purpose bigger than money. And it doesn't mean it doesn't have to satisfy its shareholders. It's been going through a very difficult time in the last 4 to 5 years, and it's coming out the other end. And there have been some painful changes within the organisation as a result of that. But it's very clear about its purpose, which has never throughout its history been about money. I find it quite fascinating.
And I think that plays a big part in longevity as well, because if the purpose extends into a more holistic space, you know, seeing one's entity as an integral part of our whole living system, then I think the way we behave, the motivations that we have behind our actions, providing that purpose, really does play through all aspects of the organisation and is signed up to by the board and the shareholders. Then I think, you know, there, relatively simply in many ways, you've got quite a good set of cogs that subtly but potentially quite profoundly shift the way the business operates, and potentially then explains its 175 years.
Yeah, you know, from a construction company started to build bricks to build houses for people that needed houses to, you know, 175 years later, a learning organisation that exists to help people progress through their life through learning. It's quite an amazing achievement, I think.
And for me, within this, this is not to be anti-profit at all or anti-money, because again, if we see them as sources of energy, we know, you know, just taking our own individual physical body, we know we have to have enough in the bank, enough energy in the bank to go out and live our life in the way we want to live it. That we've got to have that healthy flow through us, and a business is no different in that respect. It's a living entity that has to be sustained and sustainable in the energy flow that goes through it. But money is only one source of energy, and businesses, organizations, entities that can start to open itself to seeing energy on a broader spectrum, and recognizing that that comes from within its employees, from within its relationships with third parties, be they suppliers, be they partners, from within the energies of their communities in which they operate, and see that flow on a much more holistic level. I think that changes the way in which we then start to see money as simply an expression of that health rather than an end in its own right. And that's where we have to shift the relationship with money.
Yeah, I'm with you on that.
Not easy, of course, because we know that the financial system, the economic system, is so deeply ingrained in our cultural psyche, and particularly in the West. I mean, perhaps less so in the East and Asian cultures, although growing that way, as we can see, and moving that way. at a rapid rate. But how do we shift our attitude and relationship with money, and also with the material world? Because if we don't start to shift that, then we're constantly, people generally are looking for meaning in the physical, bigger car, nicer house, whatever it might be, instead of in the interconnection between people and the quality of their life from a meaning and value point of view. And so there's a much wider education and connection. And this isn't something we can force, but we can help dialogue around that space.
Sonia speaking. I have as well the feeling that naturally with the young generation, the millennials and the followers, we can see that more of them want meaning in what they do, and they don't have the same faithfulness than the previous generation. Which I connect with the fact and the realization that actually when you look at the financial system, last century you had a strong country which was based on the amount of gold or precious metal which the country owned. Today, actually, when you look at the value which is calculated for the financial system, we can see that it's completely artificial, and we base the calculation of the money you can make on shares on the profit you can do from 1 second to another nanosecond virtually. So perhaps there is a question about why do we continue to value that profit, that artificial profit? Why not valuing, for example, what the company would do for the environment, for the earth, you was showing the UN goals. This could be a reference on how the share of a company could go higher if it responds or contributes to one of these goals.
I think that's a fabulous idea. And you're right, redefining the way in which an organization is valued on the stock market, on the whatever measure we might have for it. I think that's a brilliant way to challenge and redefine the relationship between business and the world. I'm conscious that we're getting close to the end of our booked time, so I just wanted to firstly thank everybody for contributing, and I'm going to put us all on mute just to finish up here today, but again I'll open it just at the end in case anybody's got anything else they want to say, if that's all right. Okay, so I wanted to just wrap up this session with a couple of thoughts about what we can do or what needs to be done. And if we take these various themes, for me, one of the key factors that will define how we go forward on any of these themes comes down to leadership. Leadership, yes, of course, in the hierarchical sense. Yes, of course, in that we've spoken about chief executives and shareholders and boards and all those who sit at the traditional top of an organization. So definitely that type of leadership. But leadership at all levels, the younger people coming in offer us the opportunity to see leadership in a new way. Greta Thunberg, for example, is a leader. She is out there generating a new message, inspiring and generating followership and action. And we see that across, many young people have stood up, stepped out and taken up the mantle of some of the conversations that need to be going on, and not shied away from that. So we need to see more leadership, and we need to find a way in which we can each play our part. And Jack Ma, who is the co-founder and chair of Alibaba, which is actually quite a positively purposed organization, even though it's massive, and one could argue in many ways quite capitalist. But anyway, Jack Ma has given what I think is a useful insight into this, that when we change, when we as individuals change, and we know this, that when we make a change, the world changes. So in order to shift some of these elements, we have to start at home. We have to look at our own actions and our own attitudes, and how we express those within the world, and who we express them to, and how we go about influencing other people. And this idea of philanthropy, which we often associate with, those who've got lots of money, it's not about that. It's about waking up the consciousness of people, and that level of challenge into where is our consciousness, what are we paying attention to, what are we doing. These are some of the things that we at any level, in every walk of life, can take on and take responsibility for. Is there such a thing as a blueprint? Well, it's certainly not easy. It certainly requires a lot of disruption, and now is like no other time, the time to disrupt. I think we have to redefine growth. We in any organization I go into, there's always this talk about growth, and it's always linked to financial growth. Growth comes in many, many different forms: personal, individual growth, relationship growth, solving world problems growth. Growth needs redefining, not just to be profit oriented, shareholder beneficial, and it needs to be more ethically and morally focused. We've talked about purpose, and I think that's a fundamental factor in a new blueprint. We've got to really focus on greater good. We've got to go beyond our individual selves and our individual organizations, and see ourselves and see those organizations within the context of our world and within the context of our universe even. So we've got to live by some principles of community and connectedness, be global neighbors, really see ourselves in that space and think about how we can be good neighbors. We need to recognize that technology is something that we have skillfully created, used our intellect and created, but we need to put it in support of the purpose and not see it simply as a means to become more efficient in squeezing more out of the assets, but see it as a way to open and expand and advance the world in which we live, and make it more effective rather than just more profitable. And that obviously underpinning all of that is truly focusing on sustainability, thinking about our planet, people, all kingdoms in nature, and how those interplay with each other within the context of the product or the service that our businesses operate. And just to close up with my final thought, John Shah, who was an economist, says about this subject of leadership: the future is not some place we are going to, but one we are creating. We have to see ourselves as a creative force. It's not about finding the paths that already exist. It's about making them. And as we go about creating and forging those new paths, we have to be prepared that we change as the leaders in that process, but so does the destination, and that we are instrumental in choosing a new destination and a new way forward.